Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Frédéric Chopin. Today's episode is about the Chopin people think they know, and the one who keeps slipping past the stereotype. He was a quiet salon musician who almost never played big public concerts, a radical innovator who changed piano writing from the inside, and a Polish exile whose music carried national meaning without turning into blunt propaganda. And around all of that, there's the illness, the George Sand years, the preserved heart in Warsaw, and the long afterlife that turned him into both a legend and, sometimes, a misunderstanding. One of the strangest things about Chopin is that he became internationally famous while giving only around 30 public performances in his whole life. That sounds impossible now, but it makes sense once you remember where he actually wanted to play. He preferred Parisian salons, smaller rooms, where subtle coloring, tiny shifts in rhythm, and all the finer shades of his music could actually be heard. He even said concerts are never real music, which is a wonderfully confrontational thing to say for someone who became one of the era's most celebrated composers. He could afford that attitude because he wasn't depending on flashy touring for income. Most of his financial independence came from publishing and from teaching wealthy students, which let him avoid the public virtuoso circuit he disliked. That put him in sharp contrast with Franz Liszt, who represented the opposite model: theatrical, public, high-voltage performance culture. Chopin's reputation isn't just about mood or elegance. He genuinely reorganized what piano music could do. He took relatively compact forms and made them major artistic statements. The ballade and scherzo became independent concert genres in his hands. The nocturne grew far beyond John Field's model, and the etude stopped being a technical exercise with pretty wallpaper on top. With Chopin, the etudes became poetic, structurally serious, and technically demanding in ways that still intimidate pianists. He expanded piano technique through full keyboard writing, double octaves, repeated notes, intricate ornamentation, and those cross rhythms that make players count 4 against 3 and quietly reconsider their life choices. But the point wasn't athletic display for its own sake. All of that difficulty is woven into refined melody and harmony. A great example is the 24 Preludes Opus 28, which move through every major and minor key in a circle of fifths sequence inspired by Bach. They're tiny pieces, but together they make a complete world, systematic in design, emotionally, all over the map in the best way. His harmony was just as adventurous. He loved delaying cadences, slipping into remote keys, using modal colors, Neapolitan sixths, and diminished sevenths. That language reaches forward to later composers, especially Debussy, even though Chopin's sound remains unmistakably his own. Chopin's mazurkas and polonaises became powerful symbols of Polish identity, especially for exiles after the failed November uprising of 1830. Robert Schumann called his works canon buried in flowers, which is probably the most romantic review line imaginable, but it gets at something real. The political force in this music often comes wrapped in grace, refinement, and compression, rather than obvious messaging. At the same time, the nationalist story can get simplified. Scholars point out that Chopin also drew heavily on Bach, Beethoven, Schubert, Field, and the broader salon world around him. And some argue the mazurkas reflect urbanized Warsaw styles more than direct folk transcription. So his patriotism wasn't simple folk quotation or program music with a flag attached to it. It was more like a transformation of Polish forms into sophisticated concert music, abstract enough to travel internationally while still carrying the charge of a nation fighting to survive. His relationship with George Sand lasted about 9 years, and it coincided with some of his most productive work, especially during summers at Nohant. Before that, there was the infamous stay in Majorca in 1838 and 1839, which sounds miserable on paper: illness, cold, hostile lodging, and the logistical drama of getting his Pleyel piano where it needed to be. Artistically, though, it was fruitful, which feels very on brand for Romanticism: emotional disaster, excellent output. Over time, Sand shifted from lover to caregiver as Chopin's health worsened, and family tensions involving her daughter Solange helped break the relationship apart in 1846. Her novel, Lucrezia Floriani, was widely read as an unflattering fictional version of their relationship. So even in the 19th century, there was already a kind of literary subtweeting happening. There's also long-running discussion about Chopin's letters to Titus Wojciechowski, which use language modern readers may hear as homoerotic. Historians tend to caution against mapping modern sexual categories too neatly onto Romantic-era male friendship, where intense declarations of affection were written differently than they are now. So the letters matter, but they need context more than quick labeling. Chopin was ill for most of his life, and he died in Paris in 1849 at just 39. You can see the effect on his late output. After about a dozen works in 1841, the pace falls off sharply. 6 works in 1842, 6 shorter pieces in 1843, and in 1844, only the Sonata Opus 58. His death certificate listed tuberculosis, but later theories have ranged from cystic fibrosis and cirrhosis to alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and even temporal lobe epilepsy, to explain reported hallucinations. A 2014 visual examination of his preserved heart pointed back toward chronic tuberculosis, complicated by pericarditis. And yes, preserved heart is literal here. His sister Ludwika secretly carried his heart back to Warsaw, where it was eventually sealed inside a pillar of Holy Cross Church. His body stayed in Paris, but that heart became a physical emblem of his bond with Poland. It's hard to think of a more direct symbol of exile and return. One of the most interesting things about Chopin is that the way he wanted his music played may be partly at odds with the spaces and habits we use now. His teaching rejected rigid standardized technique. He emphasized coordinated use of the fingers, hand, wrist, forearm, and upper arm to create varied tone and effortless dexterity. So even his physical approach was about flexibility and color, not mechanical force. He also demanded rhythmic discipline from students and pushed back against exaggerated, lingering, and sloppy rubato. That's important because Chopin now gets treated as shorthand for floating, endlessly elastic tempo. Contemporary evidence suggests his rubato was much more controlled, more localized, and closely tied to melodic phrasing. The bigger interpretive problem is that modern conservatory training and recording culture are built for large halls and projection. You can preserve every note and still lose the delicate sound world his technique was designed for. Chopin's influence spread far beyond the solo piano corner people sometimes box him into. Liszt, Debussy, Grieg, Dvorak, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, and Szymanowski all absorbed parts of his harmony, his national idioms, or his pianistic language. He also inspired a whole institutional culture around his name, including the International Chopin Piano Competition in Warsaw, founded in 1927 and still held every 5 years, plus more than 80 Chopin societies around the world. At the same time, his image got wrapped up in romantic myth very early. The exile, the illness, the doomed love life, the political symbolism, the early death. That story is powerful, but it can flatten him into a fragile salon poet. Critics like Edward Said and Charles Rosen have pushed back on that by stressing the rigor of his planning, his polyphony, and the originality of his harmonic thinking. So the fuller picture is better anyway. Not a delicate miniature figure, but a composer of extraordinary control whose intimacy was a choice, not a limitation. That's the Chopin worth hanging on to. Private but influential, refined but radical, and much tougher-minded than the cliché usually allows. And maybe that's why the music lasts. It sounds intimate, but it never feels small. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.